People often say that courage appears only in grand moments, but sometimes it awakens quietly in the heart of a woman who has been hurt too many times. On that gray morning, Diep stood in the small courtyard of her rented house, hands trembling slightly as she brushed the dust off a basket of grapefruits. Her breath was uneven, not because of the work, but because of the storm gathering inside her chest. She had always been gentle, the kind of girl who lowered her eyes when scolded, who apologized even when she wasn't wrong. But that version of Diep was slowly fading. Everything changed the moment James disappeared into silence, and pain became her teacher. That morning, little Nee sat beside her, swinging her legs while chewing on a piece of dried fruit. "Mammy Diep," the little girl asked softly, "when will Uncle James come back?" Diep paused. A sting pierced her heart, the kind of sting she had learned to hide. "He will come back," she replied, forcing a smile, "but only when he's safe." Safe. Such a simple word, but one that carried the weight of everything she had endured these past months. James's father, Mr. Juan, wealthy, proud, merciless, had treated James as if he were a burden rather than a son. The man's cruelty had chased James into hiding, pushed him into danger, and forced Diep into a role she never asked for: protector. It was ridiculous, she thought bitterly. She was just a girl from the countryside, someone who cried because her hands got scratched while harvesting corn. Yet now she found herself preparing for something far greater, standing up against a man whose power could crush her without effort. Still, she wasn't afraid. Not anymore, because fear was nothing compared to the thought of James suffering alone. Diep set the grapefruits aside, straightened her back, and wiped her hands on her old cotton pants. Her heartbeat steadied, slow and determined. She remembered James's voice, deep, gentle, a little tired, telling her that she deserved better, that she had strength she didn't know how to use. Maybe he never imagined she would use that strength to defend him. A breeze swept through the yard, carrying the faint scent of dust and early morning dew. Diep looked at the sky, pale, quiet, and endless, as if it were waiting for her decision. And in that moment, she whispered to herself, "I will not let him suffer alone. Not this time." What James didn't know, what Mr. Juan couldn't imagine, was that Diep was no longer the weak, trembling girl they thought she was. She was a rising storm, silent but unstoppable. The next morning arrived with a kind of heaviness that pressed against Diep's chest. The sky was the color of bruised steel, and the wind carried the smell of rain, a warning, perhaps, or a reminder that storms often come quietly before they strike. Diep packed her small bag, her hands steady, but her heart racing beneath her ribs. She had made up her mind. Today, she would do something no one expected from a poor village girl. Today, she would stand before Mr. Juan, the man who drove James away, the man whose coldness had nearly destroyed him. As she tightened the strap of her bag, Nee looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy Diep, are you going to find Uncle James?" Diep crouched down, brushed a strand of hair away from the girl's forehead, and kissed her cheek. "No, sweetheart. Today, I'm going to protect him." There was something strangely empowering about saying that aloud. It made her feel taller, stronger, as though courage had finally found its way into her bones. She walked toward the main road, the dust rising around her feet with each step. As she moved, memories flooded her mind. The way James had held her hands when she was trembling, the gentle way he encouraged her to read, to think, to believe she could be more than her past. She owed him nothing, yet gave him everything. Maybe that's what love does. It transforms fear into determination. By the time she reached the gate of the Juan family mansion, her pulse had become a wild drumbeat. The guards exchanged questioning looks when they saw her. She was an odd sight among the polished marble walls and towering gates. I need to meet Mr. Juan," she said, voice trembling at first, but the tremble did not last. The guards hesitated, but something about Diep's eyes, fierce, unwavering, made them step aside. Inside, the house felt like another world. Smooth floors, silent hallways, air too clean, too cold. Every step she took echoed sharply, as if the house itself was judging her presence. Finally, she reached the study door. Her heart thumped louder. "He's behind this door," she thought. "The man who hurt James. The man who thinks he can crush anyone who stands in his way." She inhaled deeply. Then she pushed the door open. Mr. Huan looked up slowly, irritation flickering across his face until he realized who she was. His expression hardened into ice. "You?" he said. "What are you doing here?" Diep swallowed, but her voice came out steady, stronger than she felt. "I came to talk about James." For a brief second, silence filled the room, a heavy, electric silence. And then, softly but firmly, Diep added, "And I will not leave until you hear me." There was a silence, the kind that stretches thin like an old thread, one pull away from snapping. Diep felt it press against her chest as she stood between James and the man who had cast a shadow over his entire life. The air smelled faintly of rain, the type of scent that usually promises renewal, but tonight it felt more like a warning. James didn't say a word. He simply stared at the floor, shoulders drawn in, fists tight. It was as if all the storms he had ever endured were gathering behind his eyes. Diep could almost hear the tremble in his breath. He was a man trying so hard to stay strong, yet the presence of his father stripped away every layer he had carefully built. For a moment she wondered, what kind of pain does it take for a son to fear the sound of his father's voice? And the thought alone made her heart tighten. His father's cold gaze moved to her. "And who are you," he demanded, "to interfere in matters that do not belong to you?" It wasn't the words that frightened her. It was the ease with which he said them, as though people were nothing but pieces he could rearrange. Diep lifted her chin, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when she answered. "I'm someone who won't let you crush him anymore." Her own courage startled her. She had always thought bravery belonged to people who climbed mountains or stood on stages, not to someone who sold vegetables, cooked simple meals, and laughed at small joys. But life has a strange way of revealing strength at the exact moment we fear we have none left. James looked up, his eyes widening, as if he had just realized she wasn't standing beside him, she was standing for him. His father scoffed, but there was a flicker of surprise before he hid it behind arrogance. "You think you can protect him from the consequences of his own weakness?" Diep stepped closer to James, close enough to feel the tremor in his breath. "He isn't weak," she said softly. "He's tired, and tired people don't need judgment. They need someone to believe in them." The room shifted. Even the rain outside began to fall more softly, like it was listening. And in that quiet, something unspoken passed between James and Diep. A promise, fragile yet powerful, that neither of them would face their battles alone. Sometimes, a single night can change the way two people look at each other forever. And for James, the night Diep stood between him and his father felt like waking up from a long, painful dream. But morning arrived quietly, slipping through the window like a shy visitor. The first rays of sunlight brushed against the room, softening the sharp edges left from the confrontation. Diep woke first. She watched James sleeping on the couch, exhausted, brow still furrowed, as if fighting battles even in his dreams. She reached out and gently pulled the blanket up to his shoulders. It was such an ordinary gesture, so simple, yet her hands trembled. How strange that the smallest acts of care can carry the heaviest truths. When James finally opened his eyes, They weren't filled with fear or confusion like the night before. Instead, there was something else, something almost childlike. Relief? Gratitude? Or maybe the quiet certainty that someone finally saw him, not as a CEO or a son, but as a human being who deserved softness. "You stayed," he whispered. Diep smiled, though her heart beat unsteadily. "Of course." But the silence that followed wasn't the peaceful kind. It held questions, unspoken and tremulous, as fragile as morning dew. James sat up slowly, rubbing his palms together, a habit he had whenever he felt guilty. "Diep," his voice cracked slightly. "My father, he destroys everything he touches. I don't want you caught in that." There it was, the fear he could never admit last night, the fear of losing her. Diep leaned against the table, listening to the quiet hum of life outside, vendors calling out fresh produce, the sound of motorbikes starting, children laughing on their way to school. Everyday life continued, beautifully unaware that two hearts inside this small room were rewriting their destinies. "James," she answered gently, "I won't walk away just because things are difficult. You taught me how to be brave. Last night, I taught you how to let someone stand with you." He looked at her like sunlight after years of storms. Slowly, as if she might disappear, he reached for her hand. "Thank you for protecting me, even from myself." Diep squeezed his hand, and for the first time he felt the weight he had carried for so many years begin to lift. Because love, when chosen without fear, becomes the strongest shield of all. A meaningful life lesson. In the story of Diep and James, there is a lesson that quietly shines beneath every moment of conflict, courage, and tenderness. Sometimes the greatest strength is not the ability to fight alone, but the willingness to let someone stand beside you. James spent years believing he had to carry every burden, hide every wound, and face every battle without showing weakness. Many people in real life do the same, thinking that independence means silence and that love only brings vulnerability. But Diep's courage revealed a different truth. Love is not about rescuing someone. It is about reminding them they don't have to face the world alone. When she stood up to James's father, she didn't do it to prove she was strong. She did it to show James that he was worth protecting, worth loving, worth fighting for. And in that moment, James learned something essential. Letting someone care for you is not a weakness, it is a form of healing. For the audience, the lesson is simple yet powerful. Allow yourself to trust the people who show you genuine kindness. Remember that courage can come from the quietest gestures. Understand that love grows deepest not in perfect moments, but in the storms you survive together. And above all, choose the people who choose you, even when life becomes difficult, even when fear whispers otherwise. This is how two hearts become stronger than any cruelty, any darkness, or any past that tries to break them.